of the process you were while the book was being written?
I was very aware because she's been writing it for so long. I remember going into her house and seeing her wall of the one room was just this huge cork board, and I thought, my God, if I have to do that, I'll never finish a book. But she's the one that turned me on to Scrivener's literature and latte program, which it's written for writers. And she said that she probably would be years down the road before she ever finished that book if she hadn't found that, because it just does all the cork board things and you can arrange it in. It's just an amazing program. And it's cheap.
Called Scrivener's?
It's Scrivener. It's literature and latte. If you type in literature and latte, you'll find it. Any kind of book or any kind of writing, they've got a setup for it. It's absolutely amazing. And I just know how to write on it right now. I don't know jack shit about it. Denise knows it pretty well by now.
Yeah.
So when I start being serious about putting it all in a book form, then I'm going to pay her to help me, I guess.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I'm curious about, Denise, is that
her writing.
I know Denise more as a poet, so it's interesting to me. One of the things I'd want to ask her is that transition from writing poetry to writing a novel. And didn't some of the inspiration from this come from poems that she had written? Is that right?
Who's to know?
You'll have to ask her. The story she told us is it was someone else's poem in a small group, I believe. That was the kind of initial inspiration. It's a good story.
Yeah. And
Glenda said it was a poem by Carol Marx that inspired her to do that.
Oh, okay.
Carol Marx has little scrapbooks.
Carol Marx, what? You're cracking up.
Carol Marx has some published books of poetry.
Okay. And Lynn, since you've just joined us, can you tell us a little bit about how you came across the book and
I'm good friends with Daryl and Vivian, Bill's brother and his wife, and I think Vivian gave me the book to read.
Okay.
And it was gripping.
It was very gripping.
It was like eating chocolate. I couldn't put it down. I read the whole thing all at once, and I'm not a writer. I just read a lot, and I just couldn't put it down.
Yeah.
I can't tell you why not, because it was like to me, it was like a simple setting, a simple story, but it sort of gave me a real picture of how maybe people, not just the day-to-day living of country farming people in southern Indiana is what I got from it. I want the next one. I want to know what happens to Vera.
I kind of got the impression Vera was going to be fine.
I think she'll be fine.
Yeah.
She'll end up at the UU church, I imagine.
So she's already in Bloomington. And I want to hear about that period of living in Bloomington.
Yeah, that's kind of interesting that she wound up in Bloomington, I thought.
Yeah. I'm a terrible junkie for romantic novels that are well written.
Well, this one actually surprised me. I mean, I did not realize it was going to be such a romantic novel, and I would describe it as a page turner for me. I just was surprised, and I think the thing that impressed me the most was her character development and how over the course of the book, my thoughts and opinions of the different characters changed. And I don't know, I just felt like the way she wrote made you empathetic to all the characters in the book, which, like, when I started reading it, I'm like, God, Hal's such an ass, I mean, I was just like, kill him, bastard, all those things that you think when you're and then you keep getting more and more into it and reading about his experience in the war and all that and how traumatized he was. It was just interesting to me to see how my own opinions and then my compassion kind of grew for each individual experience over the course of the book.
That was one of the things our discussion found the most remarkable, is how all the characters are so fully humanized and really fully developed. And, you know, a narrative is kind of lopsided if you really can't stand a character and somebody you really respect, like May, is still giving them a chance. You know, it makes you think less of May by definition, if that was the case.
Yeah, like at the beginning, it was hard for me to like May a whole lot because I just kept wondering how she was putting up with this situation, you know, and what was wrong with her that she would have this woman come and live there. And, you know, this was kind of neat to see how that developed.
And why do we think why did she leap to that solution?
It seemed extreme, but
I mean, think she had any other solutions except to leave him. I mean, given her situation and her position, where she lived and how she lived and that set of times, what were her options?
But that's kind of an assumption on her part that he would leave her. I mean, there's an insecurity about if she let it play out, where she would come out. Do you think?
Wanting to risk that.
Yeah, it seems like she really, like the character really believed that the family had, I mean, and I keep putting in the context of the time period too, but that the family had to maintain together or else it was just going to be disastrous for all involved, is kind of the way she felt about it. So it didn't even seem like she gave any room to even consider. She was mad, but she wasn't even considering like having Hal leave, you know? I mean, that's how it seemed to me. It just was immediately, I got to make it all right. You know, that's how it felt.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that it was Denise's grandparents' generation that, you know, were the main characters. So, you know, that would have been my parents' generation, but her grandparents' generation. And I'm wondering why Denise chose that particular time period. And that's one of the things I'd like to ask her. But, you know, the post-World War II era was an era of rapid technological and social change. So it was kind of on a cusp of a lot of changes in roles for women and that sort of thing. I kept thinking that the options then for supporting yourself as a young mother were really limited, and that would play into the decision about how important it was to try and keep the family together. Like, what are your options as a young woman at that time period?
It was after all Hal's house. It was Hal's family's house. So those options were extremely limited. The interesting thing is that, the fact that Denise created this story is indicative only of the fact that it happens because after every war, there are circumstances in which that kind of radical change in culture and everything and separation of families in war, those things happen. And so I think possibility when it's not unrealistic at all. I think human relations are as varied as we can imagine.
I wanted to bring up something real quickly on that. I looked into, I've been doing a lot of, you know, family history research and that sort of thing. And I was looking into the situation after the Civil War. And apparently, you know, family relationships were extremely variable after the Civil War, with lots of bigamy related to the war, with the widows' pensions being new and people having to claim certain things to get the pensions. And, so I think maybe a lot of the problem with my response was a limited view myself of the history of fluidity in families, and that it has been much more fluid in the past than I had imagined.
That's interesting.
Well, and you also think about the times that aren't even post-war or whatever, where men have to leave home to find employment, and the havoc that wreaks on families. Because if he
Right.
hadn't been working somewhere else during the week, Vera would never have happened, presumably.
Yeah, that's a good point too. But it's interesting how May was just, well, May has a child too with Hal, but how she was just so set in this has to be kept this exact way, whereas it seemed like with Vera, she was just crazy in love and will do anything and kind of uproot herself and go wherever it takes to, it just was two really very different kinds of personalities on the two women that were the main characters, and I found that to be really interesting.
I thought the subtle way she dealt with the dress that Vera made, in fact, I missed it completely. I had to ask her about it. I said, what the hell happened to the dress? And she said, go back and read it again. I thought that was a really subtle way to end that thing. It was pretty cool.
So I have to confess, I read it in January and I liked it so much I sent it to my daughter, and I wasn't able to reread it. So tell me again what happens to the dress.
Well, she made that dress for May, and at the end, I missed. It was Vera's making the dress for May, right? Yeah, Vera made the dress for May, and she left it in the closet. And I never heard anything. I didn't notice that the next time, when she's describing that her noticed hemline was different or something than what she usually wore. That was just a little subtle reference to what she was wearing, meant that she was wearing the dress that Vera made. And I'd have to go back and look at that line again to see exactly how she did it. But it was a very subtle thing. I missed it completely. I thought that hell, she must have taken the dress with her, but she didn't.
So are you saying that at the end of the book, when she's talking about her like comfort level, that was the dress that was making her uncomfortable? I mean, that's really interesting. Hi, Denise.
Hello.
Denise, we're having a discussion about May's dress.
I think you can answer some questions for us now.
Having a discussion about May's dress, and I called you and said, what the hell happened to May's dress? And you said, I forget how you dealt with it exactly now, but it was in describing the fact that she was wearing a different style or a different hemline or something. Tell me about that again.
Oh, Vera left May's dress hanging on the back of the door, and it had to be hemmed. And actually later, when Hal was looking at May and wondering whatever happened to the short hemlines, in my mind, that was that dress that she was wearing, although it wasn't specified there. But in my head, she had the dress on.
Interesting.
I thought when I read the book, when I finished the book, I thought maybe Vera had taken the dress with her because I couldn't remember it being resolved. And then when you pointed that out, I went back and looked at it, and yes, you did resolve it very subtly.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, Denise. We've got a small but mighty group, I'd say, and a few questions for you have popped up, I think. And I didn't realize that Marty had a peach pie recipe in your book. It's kind of neat. One of the things I think that has been recurring is kind of wondering exactly why you chose the time period you did, like how that came about?
Yeah, I actually, I'm not sure it was really a conscious choice. The very first beginning of a draft of this book was a fast write that I did long ago, and just kind of, it was May's voice that came to me first, and her sort of talking about her life, and so it was, I definitely had a sense of, from her voice and what she talked about, I had a sense of kind of what generation she was from. And I think I was writing about a place that was familiar to me, and ended up more or less, I think, nailing down the details of like exactly what years it was, or exactly what time frame it was, probably just partly to align it with the generations in my family, so I could keep track of of where we were in
Yeah.
the world. You know, okay, this person is about as old as that person, and and also I didn't want it to be during the war, because I was interested in writing about I wasn't really interested in writing about the wartime experience, and so I wanted to, I bumped it after that. So yeah, it was an interesting time to me, that was when my own grandmother was a young adult, and it just, it was fun to explore that.
Mm-hmm. Times were very, very different then.
Denise, did you talk to your grandmother about being a young adult then?
You know, a little bit. I've had a few conversations with her, more just generally curiosity about her life. I've asked her a couple of questions that were kind of detailed questions. I don't remember what they are right now, but you know, at one point I was like, I need to call Granny because she would know this. But mostly I left her out of the process of the novel, because her religious and political beliefs are so utterly different from mine, that I didn't think she would. I didn't think she'd appreciate being part of creating the novel. It turned out that she did read it, which I never expected her to do, and liked it, although she, you know, didn't. She had some moral qualms about it, but she actually read the whole thing and liked it, which completely blew me away. That was way beyond my expectations of her flexibility, and so that was pretty cool.
It's interesting. It makes me think of May's mother and that relationship, and how that kind of, May came to look at her mother a little differently by the end of the book.
Yeah. Yeah, those issues of religious difference and how beliefs work in people's lives are just, I think they're really deeply interesting to me, because I grew up with that. You know, I grew up with parents who started out fundamentalist Christian, and then by the time I was aware of things, were sort of mainline Christian, and then left the church entirely. And there was a lot of difference in the family, and then also a lot of culture that still was passed down, even though we weren't in that church anymore. You know, the music of the church and the language of the church still were very much part of my culture. So for me, that religion is interesting, spirituality is interesting, and the way those work at the family, just I kind of had to write about it, I think, because it's just, you know, it's fascinating.
That's really interesting. I hadn't looked at it from that perspective, you know, like your life experience with religion and your family experience. So that's an interesting insight to have.
I did call a friend of mine over here in Uncanny a while ago to see if she was available to join us. She's in her 80s, so she's in somewhat the generation of between my generation and Glenda's grandmother's generations, mother's. What? Yeah. Anyway, so she's sort of in between that. And I called her, and she wanted to join, but she's volunteering at the thrift store all day in Spencer, so she couldn't. But she said, I couldn't put the book down. She said, I, just never ever thought of anything like that. She said, it greatly expanded my horizons.
Huh.
She said, I was just blown away. She said, it was just so far beyond my imagination. But she said it definitely expanded my horizons.
That's interesting.
It's actually quite a compliment, I'd say, to expand the horizons of someone who's in their 80s and, to really have it change their outlook on things. That's cool.
Yeah, I've found it really satisfying to know that people are reading the book, and then also to hear various responses to it, and to know that other people who I haven't had conversations with are also out there reading it, and sort of completing the writing process in a way that writing a novel is writing a novel, but once I was clear that I wanted to share it with other people, it really is completed when the reader reads it and makes the story in their own mind. And I know I probably wouldn't recognize the houses or the people or the clothing that other people are imagining when they read this, and might not recognize a lot of things. People take away really different things from the book and are moved or influenced or annoyed or outraged or whatever. There's all kinds of reactions that people have depending on what they bring into it. And I really love that. It feels like a collaborative creation, and yet I don't have to be out there personally collaborating with all those people, which would be hard for an introvert to do.
That makes me think of artwork, well, I mean, writing's an art too, but I just think how many different interpretations you can have. It can be any perspective that someone could have by looking at a work of art, and it might have absolutely nothing to do with what the artist themselves was thinking or doing when they were painting or creating it. So that's kind of fun to think that words have that same impact. I mean, I know that about poetry, but it's interesting in a novel, you kind of figure, you're going to read this novel and everybody's going to kind of have a little bit of the same, interpretation of it. But it's funny that I have one friend, and I will not name her, but she bought the book, and she just seems really mad about it. I mean, she's just, like we talk about it, she's just like, I don't know. I don't understand. I'm just mad. And, I think it's, the whole infidelity thing, and who knows what that, button pushed. But it is funny because for me, I was just so touched by how the characters grew and changed, and I got more compassion for them. The end of the book, I just started crying. I mean, it just was like, and I can't even explain why, but I did. I just cried. That took me by surprise too,
Yeah.
So it's
yeah, I think I think it's been fascinating. I mean, over the years, I've read and shared parts of the with my groups at Women Writing for a Change with other writers, and so I've had some feedback over the years in the different drafts of the novel, and then had folks who read it for me when it was nearly done to give me some feedback, and then I'm getting feedback now from the published novel, and I really think people bring their own kind of unanswered questions or unresolved pain or things that are there for them that are kind of have a charge of some kind into the reading experience. And depending on what that is that they bring in, people really do have a very different emotional response to the book. There are quite a few people who get angry reading it. A lot of them like the book, but a lot of their experience is being mad. And I don't really like books that make me mad. But then others really feel, focus on really different aspects of it. So I think it's people's experience and more what people what it is that people bring into it with them. And so then as they identify with those characters, how it pulls them around and affects their feelings is really different.
Well, it seems to me, I remember the first real book I read as a child. I mean, real literature. As a young person, I think I was in the 6th grade at the Oden School Library, which was between the grade school and the high school, in a little bitty room. Picked out a book called In Dubious Battle, which I thought was about war, and I was enamored by war. It was Steinbeck's book, and it was about war. It's about class war. But the librarian was a wise librarian, older woman, and she said, "Billy, this is a very adult book, but if it keeps your attention, you're old enough to read it." So she let me read it, and I became a snob for good writing the rest of my life. But it seems to me the book challenged even at that age, it was beginning to challenge a lot of things, because Steinbeck was not a Christian. And Steinbeck was not a gospel singer or anything like that. He was a reader of a literary fiction writer. And I think that's what literary fiction does at its best. It takes you into it and it helps you regurgitate your own ideas as you do that, and look at what you've been eating all your life, and you find out that your appetites change.
That's a really disturbing metaphor. I can, but a good one. I like it.
It's interesting. I think Steinbeck was the first book that just blew me away. I think I was also in 6th grade, and it was The Pearl. Oh my God, that book just, I'd never read anything like that before. And I just remember being kind of devastated, but never looking at books the same again. This wasn't like a fun fairy tale. This is like life, Yeah. So it's interesting.
Well, what does it say about me that I hated Steinbeck at that age? I just found it, I think he was the first writer I found just oppressively male.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
No
Denise,
offense.
He certainly was.
Denise, I'm wondering, it seems like the family influences are, clear in the book, and the place, from your own experiences, but what were major influences in writing this book that weren't from your direct experience? Like what books or poems, or what other influences do you think were brought into this particular novel?
That's a good question. I'm not terribly conscious of that, I think, because I was just sort of down in the well of writing the novel. And I'm not sure I was aware of where the drops were coming from that were falling on me down there. But I know that I remember reading some of Wendell Berry's fiction, and also Alice Walker's fiction at some point when I was writing it, and recognizing something that really, it was encouraging to me to read what they had written and recognize a certain kind of truth telling, and a certain kind of, it seemed like a real respect for the characters, and a respect for ordinary lives, and a kind of a faith in something. I think their faith is different, but the opposite of cynicism. And as somebody who, when I was a young adult and went briefly to college, at that point, the literary college world was really thrilled with the idea that writing was not for anything, and that mainly you wanted to be sort of, there was this kind of love of meaninglessness and bleakness, and was like, prove that you're not sentimental by being nasty. And it completely alienated me. I couldn't stand it. And I think I've encountered that, in various places in the literary world, and also found that there's a lot else out there. But I think those two writers were kind of role models for me of a way of writing that wasn't about proving your own writing ability, and it wasn't about tricking the reader or being smarter than the reader or impressing other literary people. It's just very accessible and very human, and very much writing about being human. So those are two that I keep. And the first book that I remember noticing the writing in was about the age you all were talking about. I was probably 11 or 12 when I read Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. And that book has really stayed with me, I think, just for like recognizing what can be done with language.
Thank you. That's good.
I think too that the writing is very organic. The whole farm life thing and that whole thing is so real. But I think it also points out that ordinary lives are often struck by extraordinary experiences, and that there is no real ordinary life out there. People think they live ordinary lives, but if everyone was putting on the page what their lives were, we'd find that extraordinariness is more common than we think.
Denise, it's interesting because you said that the kind of conception of the book came to you from May's voice just coming to you. And I think that the book wouldn't have had the impact it did if it wasn't told from the story of each voice, if it was just written differently. But I think that the voice was really important throughout the entire novel, whose voice it was. And it's like you had to keep kind of shifting gears on who was talking. But I mean, you really did hear, like I even in my mind, I had a voice for each voice, as I'm reading. So I think that's interesting too.
That's cool. Yeah, I really, one thing I really enjoyed about the book was writing in the voice of my own ancestors. The characters have their voice because of who they are, but then there's also the inflection and the dialect and the style of speech, which I just absolutely love the way that those relatives talk. I've always loved listening to the way that that language works in that part of the family, and in I like a lot of people's language, but that really feels like home to me. Yeah. And so it was a lot of fun to really settle into that language world and use that as sort of the materials I was working with. Mary, you were going to say something?
Oh, well, you had mentioned in our previous discussion how apportioning parts of the narrative to different characters was part of the process. And I wonder if you can elaborate on that at all, or if that's kind of gone in the past.
Yeah, there was a real turning point. I had written May's story. I was only writing in May's voice for quite a long time. And I had written her story up to the point where, like the end of part 2, where she leaves. And I got to that point and I kind of got stuck and I couldn't take it any farther. I didn't know what happened next, and I couldn't write my way into figuring it out. And what I ended up doing was writing in Vera's voice, and I went back and wrote Vera's story of the experience of her falling in love and coming to the family and all of this stuff. Started writing a lot of scenes in her voice, and then ended up carrying on from there in the alternating voices of May and Vera. And at some point in there, I started writing in Hal's voice as well, because I realized that I needed the first person myself in order to understand these people and really get to know them. I had to kind of get inside their skin. I also wrote in other characters' voices just for myself. I wrote a lot, wrote quite a long piece in May's mom's voice at one point that was really helpful to me. That didn't end up needed in the novel, but it helped me understand who she was and where she was coming from. So it was kind of a part of my process that ended up being part of the product, but it did get me around that corner in the middle of the novel to kind of go back and bring Vera in as a protagonist.
Well, sometime I'd love to hear what May's mom had to say.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of writing. I love it. You know, it's not something I would have thought of. I think that's, and it, I don't know, it just makes a lot of sense.
It was a lot, getting to know the characters was a lot like getting to know people for me. And it took a long time, and it was a lot of empathy, a lot of imagining the character's perspective and feeling how they would move through a space. And that's, that's kind of how I know real people too. But it was great to have access to the insides of their heads. And it actually felt like that, which was just weird. I mean, I don't get how that works, that I could make people up and then actually have the experience of getting to know them in a way that actually feels like getting to know them rather than making them up. I mean, that's just fascinating to me that our imaginations can work that way, but that's definitely what it felt like to me.
Well, and that's why it's such a powerful book. I mean, I don't know that that's a common way of approaching it, but I think that's, it's a very powerful book. And I think, everyone I talk to, it's like the characters are so incredibly developed. And before you got on, I was talking about how, at the beginning of the book, I was like mad and, all these feelings I had. I don't like, what's wrong with May, and, God, Hal's a jerk, and Vera's crazy. And, it just like, but as you go on reading, it's just like, you really did bring those people into a real human experience, and those opinions. And I mean, to me, that's really useful and important, because that's how we need to look at each other. We need to make each other human, instead of just a compilation of our expectations or opinions. It was good to get inside each character. So I just think it was a very well written book. How long did it take you to write it? I mean, from kind of seriously sitting down to start to write it to the end?
It, from the very beginning to the very end, it was about 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of those years, it was, an hour or 2, 3 days a week in between raising a kid and farming.
Sure.
And so it was, this tiny little thread that I just kind of kept following through the first draft and the second draft, and then after that kind of focused in on rewriting in a way that I started giving more time to. And yeah, it took a long time. I was a different writer at the end than I was at the beginning, and that actually happened with some of the drafts and rewrites. I was a different writer at the end of the first draft than I had been at the beginning of the first draft, and so I kind of had to speed up my rewriting process eventually, because I needed to be the same writer through the whole thing, rather than it sounding like it was written by 2 different people. So yeah, but it was a lot of years.
Mm-hmm.
I think two things.
You're frozen, Bill.
You're very frozen. You sound like a bass
I think
guitar.
the fiction writers have to be a little bit am I internet? No, I'm frozen.
I got a little bit of that.
Yeah. Fiction writers are
schizophrenic.
Schizophrenic.
Glenda had my phone for a few minutes there, and I was away from the window. Is that better?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Okay, as I was going to say, I think to be a good fiction writer, you have to be a little schizophrenic in order to get the personalities all going in a novel. I can't imagine doing that. I mean, I think that's the most impossible thing, although I may be schizophrenic in other ways. But it also reminded me, the form of the book reminded me of Kingsolver's Poisonwood Bible, because she does the same thing in that. Basically, you just really get to know each character really well. And the other, and it's very, very different, but it's Saramago's The Cave, which is probably the most bizarre book ever written. It has no punctuation in it at all, anywhere. And yet he does so well at developing the voices that by the time you're, a few hours into the book, all of a sudden you just realize that somebody's speaking and you know who it is. There's no quotation marks. There's no he said, she said. It's just conversation all the way through the book. And it's really crazy, but it's one of my favorite books. But I think that whole ability to create people comes from an observation of people for a long time, of listening and so forth. And maybe that's why I can't write fiction. Maybe I don't listen enough.
Well, I used to be close to a short story writer, and he said these voices would just start talking to him. And that's where his characters came from. And my husband the other day was asking why I don't write any fiction. And I guess it's because nobody's talking to me in my head.
That's
except me.
Yeah, I really am interested in voice and how people sound, and I always have been. That's just something that I recognize people by their voice, and I'm fascinated by the way that both the sound of their voice and the way that they say things, and the way that I can listen to a sentence and tell you whether that's a sentence that my mom would say or not. We know how people talk if we know them well. And that just is it's really a way into a character for me. I realized after the first draft, or maybe the second or third, I realized that I had almost no information anywhere in the book about what anyone looked like. And there's still very little, but I did go back at some point and say, okay, really, it'd probably be good if these people had visible bodies, but the way that I get to know people is by the way they talk and the way they move. And that's how I wrote it. And then I had to go back and be like, okay, some people want to know what color someone's hair is, so I should probably put that in here. But yeah, the way that voices are involved in the telling of stories really interesting to me. And I did read Barbara Kingsolver's Poisonwood Bible sometime along the way, and that may have given me permission to try that multiple narrator structure, because I hadn't. That's the example I can most easily think of a book I've read that's like that. And it may have been the first one I came across.
This is a little off topic, but I was listening to NPR on the way in this morning, and they had an interview with Lorraine Newman, from the old SNL days. And the whole conversation was about how she uses voice and characters. So you might want to check that out, because it was on NPR this morning.
Cool.
Yeah, it was just fascinating, like how she uses voice to create characters.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Well, if you all have any last questions, I'm going to have to head on to my next thing pretty soon here.
The only other question I had for you was, do you have another book swirling in your mind at the moment, or in your voice is talking to you?
I have a couple that might be books, but I can't tell that, are things I've written little bits of. I've been writing poetry, and I have essays. So I have a bunch of different things that that are definitely in process for me. My vision is messed up right now, and I can't really write I can't read what I write without getting headaches. And so I'm really in a lull of my writing, which is hard. But before that happened, there was a book that I was, what felt like it might be a novel that I was working on. And then I've had another story kind of pulling at my sleeve, and I'm not sure what they'll turn into. You know, I've only done this once, writing a novel, and it wasn't what I intended to do when I started out. And so I don't really know how it starts. I don't know how to start a novel. It just kind of happened to me last time. And so I'm just sort of waiting to see if it happens again.
Yeah. That's just curious.
I hope it happens again.
I do too. I really do.
Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. I really enjoyed your book. Before you came on, I told everybody it was gripping. I didn't put it down. I read it straight through in one big deal. I stayed up real late at night. I got up the next morning and I just inhaled it.
That's cool. Thank you.
And the story stayed with me. It's something I've thought about the people. Guys, I have to leave because I have to go somewhere too. Thank you for inviting me to join you.
Thank you for being here. Yes, and thank you everybody. Denise, thank you so much for giving us your time. I know you're busy, so I appreciate it. And thank you everybody for joining this first Zoom book club of Juniper Art Gallery. Thank you.
Do you want to think about a next book? Do you have a plan forward? I mean, that's kind of why I came to help you with any logistical questions.
Yeah, I think, well, you and I maybe can continue to talk if that's, you know, on another day. I need to get out. I've actually got a tour of people from Meadowood here right now at the gallery. They were banging on the door earlier, so I kind of got to go see them. but yeah, so let's keep in touch.